What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So, I finally got around to playing through Persona 3 Reload's rendition of episode Aigis, previously known as The Answer in the West. This was an expansion slash epilogue to the original Persona 3 back on PS2 that was included in that game's re-release on the system Persona 3 FES. I wasn't particularly a fan of what I had experienced of The Answer following my original FES playthrough a few years back, leading me to dropping it pretty quickly and watching the rest of the cutscenes on YouTube, which didn't do much to convince me that this was a necessary follow-up to the main story. Due to my limited experience with that original version of The Answer slash episode Aigis, I'm going to primarily focus on Reload's interpretation of it. I do feel like I should mention the absurd way Atlus handled the pricing and distribution of this expansion. Episode Aigis is only purchasable as part of the grander expansion pass, which as far as I understand is not included in the $100 premium edition of Persona 3 Reload. I only purchased the base game at launch, so while my wallet didn't personally feel burned by this, I do think it's scummy to market a version of a game that in most cases would include all of the DLC, only to then announce this more substantial DLC a month after release and ask $35 extra for it. This aspect, coupled with my previous indifference or maybe even distaste of the original rendition of this epilogue, led me to not exactly jump out of my seat to get my hands on episode Aigis when it first launched, instead waiting to pick it up during a Steam sale for 35% off. I also want to issue a spoiler warning for not only the main story of Persona 3, but also the story of episode Aigis, as I would prefer to not have to beat around the bush regarding my gripes with certain narrative elements present here. For those of you who are able and interested in showing additional support towards me in the channel, since this is a one-man operation, I do have a Ko-fi page for direct donations as well as the myriad ways to show support through YouTube. Thank you to those who have shown support thus far, and thank you to everyone else for your consideration. So when I said at the beginning of this video that I didn't feel like episode Aigis was a necessary epilogue following my experience with FES, this sentiment is mostly in regard to the literal events of the plot and the way in which those events sort of set out to explain things that I didn't really come away from the main story asking. On the one hand, the extra context in some cases is nice, but the means by which we get those lore and character tidbits is through events that to me feel contrived as an extension of the main story. Whether it be the whole time loop thing to begin with, the abyss of time supposedly being in the basement of the dorm the entire time, these keys manifesting that need to be combined to break this sort of time loop curse, the party then dueling each other for ownership of said keys, everyone arriving in the Velvet Room together once the keys are combined, etc. and so on. Now, it's not that these various events and plot devices and whatnot aren't explained in universe. They are, very clearly I might add. I just personally don't care for them very much because I feel like they clash with what was set up and explored in the base game. With that said, what these events facilitate in terms of the characters and how they grapple with the themes present here of grief and accepting loss was something that kept me from truly hating my experience with the narrative overall, even if I don't feel like a lot of these aspects stuck the landing in the long run. And this is in large part due to my pre-existing attachment to this cast of characters, which at the very least gave me a reason to be interested in the extra tidbits of backstory we get from them. These are primarily presented via flashbacks, which is something that I have been vocal about disliking in video game storytelling, but funny enough, it didn't bother me as much as usual here because the characters are literally watching them play out together in universe. I still think that's kind of dumb, but at least it makes sense within what's been established plot-wise, as opposed to being something that is there strictly to hammer in context for the player. Even if it also serves that purpose, at least the other characters do react and have something to say about these events that they're flashing back to. Another admittedly small point that I think contributes to the themes here is how the characters don't refer to Makoto Yuki by name. I find this to be quite clever actually, as it serves two distinct roles, one being the meta role of avoiding conflict with whatever the player might have named him in the main game, but also the in-universe role of reflecting how painful the trauma of losing him was for these characters, to the point where they can't bring themselves to say his name aloud. Speaking of which, as the title of this expansion would suggest, Aigis is given the role of protagonist here, but she doesn't get Maya Amano'd, so to speak, proving that Atlus is in fact capable of providing dialogue options for gameplay purposes without sacrificing characterization in story moments. What a concept. And of course, I would be remiss to not discuss the newly introduced character here, Metis. As a character, I don't feel super strongly about her, but I do kind of enjoy what she adds to the group dynamic. What I think is more noteworthy about Metis is how her existence sets up a major aspect of Persona 4's story and how that game explores the overarching lore of Persona in general. That being, of course, the relationship between shadows and personas, the latter of which manifesting when someone accepts their shadow self. While direct continuity isn't something I really look for in this series, I do like seeing these more conceptual ties between the games, even though I am well aware that these kinds of things are rooted in Persona's ethos generally speaking, given the influence of Jungian psychology on the entire series and all of that. So overall, in terms of narrative, I come away from episode Aigis feeling strangely similarly to how I felt about Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, with the enjoyment mostly coming from select lore implications and character interactions, rather than investment in the overarching plot. To be fair to episode Aigis, the narrative here does have much more bearing on the plot of the main game it's associated with, for better or worse though in certain cases. At this point, I more so view the story here as an excuse for more dungeon crawling than anything else, since that is far and away the majority of what you'll be doing here, no matter how you slice it. Structurally, episode Aigis is basically just more Tartarus in all but name, which I could see being a major turnoff for some people, and it certainly was for me even, following my playthrough of Fess at least. When it comes to Reload though, I'm one of those weirdos that actually kinda likes Tartarus. It scratches the purity of the JRPG gameplay loop for me, which I find is actually enhanced by the procedurally generated floor layouts. However, there are quite a few notable differences and I would say downsides to the Abyss of Time over Tartarus. The first of which being the Abyss of Time's lack of progression in level theming. Tartarus, especially in Reload, maintained a sense of progress by shifting the way environments look and move from block to block, whereas here they kind of just loop through each of the themes seemingly arbitrarily. Now you could argue this makes sense narratively, since time itself is looping, but I would have vastly preferred if each of the 8 doors had more distinct environments that could more directly reflect the layers of hell they're named after. Another difference from Tartarus in more of a gameplay sense is that you can freely leave the Abyss of Time at no cost, removing pretty much any semblance of resource management present in the base game, which was already arguably flawed to begin with. Both dungeons allow you to jump through completed floors in search of wealth hands for EXP or dark zones for Twilight fragments, the latter of which can be spent at the clock to fully restore your party's HP and SP, which undermines SP as a resource that would otherwise limit how long you could dungeon crawl for. Now, including the fatigue system from Fess could have been a remedy for this, and despite my previous dismissal of that system, I don't think I would have been opposed to it returning. I just seem to recall its impact being negligible past the early game, so I didn't think it was critical for it to return. But that was also more so under the assumption that SP limitations would sort of fill the role of fatigue, as it kind of does in P4 and P5 to varying degrees. As it stands, you'd have to choose to ignore the clock for this to work, which I more or less did anyway, but I don't think that exempts this mechanic from criticism. Now those are things that apply to both Tartarus and the Abyss of Time, but at least in Tartarus, treasure chests and monad doors were limited per entry since they don't reset until you leave and come back, which then progresses the calendar and eats into your resource of time. In episode Aigis, the main incentive to leave would be to craft better equipment, restock on healing items, etc., but it's unfortunately at no cost due to the lack of the calendar as a limitation here, which in turn makes it even easier to grind for resources and fuse some of these crazy equipment options pretty quickly. Don't get me wrong, the grind was fun for a while, and getting to mess around with some of that equipment was cool, but it did lose its luster over time since that's pretty much all there is to do here. It also kind of puts a spotlight on the limited build crafting in the modern Persona games, since your party members learn specific skills at specific levels, and there's not a ton you can do to branch out beyond that, P4G bike skills notwithstanding, of course. I typically don't mind these build crafting limitations too much, since I tend to prefer when JRPG party members have more of a defined role anyway, with moment-to-moment party composition and the limited skill slots they have providing what I feel is just enough to keep battles engaging throughout these games' runtimes. But in playing through episode Aigis, I realize a big reason for this is thanks to the social aspects providing a change of pace while still contributing to your combat prowess, something that is sorely lacking here. They did add small social events to reacquire your party members' combat characteristics, but I find that these events moments lack any sort of agency, once again due to the lack of the calendar. Like sure, in the base game you will eventually unlock all of them if you know what you're doing, but at least you're making decisions along the way on who you want to prioritize, or whether you'd rather do some other nighttime activity instead, like a social link or leveling up your social stats, or going to Tartarus. I'm not necessarily saying that slapping the calendar system on episode Aigis would fix a lot of these issues, especially because that would arguably contradict the narrative elements, even though narratively technically they aren't a time crunch, despite time looping, as seen when the dorm starts to fall apart later in the story. That would then also limit the number of times you could leave the Desert of Doors maybe, but I actually think episode Aigis would have been far more interesting if it was structured more like a roguelike, especially given the time loop narrative. I think if you coupled this with the near unparalleled flow of the battles in Persona 3 Reload, you'd have the makings for a pretty interesting Persona spin-off I could actually get on board with. So when it comes to the combat specifically, there aren't really any notable changes from the base game, other than Aigis now having access to the wild card, with a few different theurgies to shake things up a bit. And to me that's kind of fine. It at least makes this version of episode Aigis more enjoyable to play than the Fest version in my opinion. Mind you, this is coming from someone who finds P3R to be easily the best playing of any Persona game, due in part to a lot of small tweaks of things that were introduced in P5, which you can hear me discuss more in depth in my initial P3R video. And so, since I've already talked about a lot of the core combat mechanics in that video, I want to dig into some facets to the combat and the systems surrounding it that I haven't previously discussed as much. Something I was reminded of in coming back to Reload is how much I love that each category of action is assigned to a different base button. Of course, this is one of those things that's kind of old news because it was originally introduced in P5. While this is a subtle change on the surface, I find that it makes interfacing with these menus more dynamic beyond just the aesthetic. What I mean is that the sequence of buttons you're pressing is inherently more interesting here than just using the D-pad and A button for everything, even if it's all still for the sake of navigating menus. I wouldn't say it's a major game changer compared to other turn-based JRPGs or anything, but the way skills are labeled, in addition to the way I tend to organize my skills, can allow for very quick execution on lines of play. Once I have a game plan in mind, whether it's scouting enemy weaknesses, exploiting said weaknesses, setting up buffs, etc. and so on, I try to make the necessary inputs as efficiently as possible while also trying to avoid mistakes. This may or may not be reflected in the gameplay footage, especially since a lot of video files came out corrupted through Shadowplay, unfortunately. I find this method of play is one way to make the often pattern-oriented nature of turn-based JRPG combat more enjoyable in terms of what you're actually inputting moment to moment, with the typical layer of strategy still present, of course. If you're still not with me, the opposite example would be if you were to hypothetically slow down or pause an action game and make those inputs more along the lines of a turn-based title. Both methods require some level of decision making, the main difference being the time allotted to the player between each of these decisions, while also rewarding some level of memorization and mastery of mechanics in order to consistently play effectively and efficiently. Now, even though I think the flow and feel of the combat is excellent here, what about the age-old question of the difficulty? Something Persona isn't exactly known for, to put it lightly. I don't really approach Persona games expecting a steep challenge, and yet I continue to crank the difficulty up every time I play them, under the assumption it'll feel more fulfilling than playing on the lower difficulty modes. And while that may be true in comparison, I do think there's room to crank things up further. But at the same time, I wouldn't say I've come away from any of these games feeling all that disappointed about it either. That said, episode Aigis is more difficult than the base game, primarily due to your limited counterplay options compared to what enemies can dish out early on, with this dynamic gradually leaning in the player's favor the further you get, which is good to an extent, as your characters getting more powerful over time is a pillar of the genre after all. But what I think ends up lacking in the long term in Persona in general is enemies' counterplay options for you. One of the ways episode Aigis tries to solve this is by giving bosses evade skills to cover their weaknesses, which I'm not particularly a fan of. Of course, agility buffs and debuffs can help mitigate the annoyance, but to me it feels like a misguided attempt to make fights more challenging, as it randomly, not even consistently, removes the aspect that gives the one more combat system its essence, that being striking weaknesses for extra turns. This is probably the main reason I often find Persona bosses that don't have weaknesses less fun to fight than ones that do, even though of course bosses with weaknesses have a chance to become trivial due to how powerful a knockdown can be. There are ways to design bosses around this, some of which I know have been used before, like making bosses immune to knockdown, and or having multiple different targets to deal with, but I haven't quite thought too hard about whether this is an inherent limitation of this combat system, or if there are other ways you could make such bosses more interesting, some of which are actually present in the base game's bosses, like the time limit on the magician fight or having to use Theurgies to break apart the Justice and Chariot bosses. While I did end up finding the difficulty of episode Aigis to be manageable in the long term, due in large part to the structural issues I mentioned earlier, there was a serious difficulty spike when it came to the 2v2 fights, particularly Akihiko and Ken. I did get close to beating them once or twice initially as I was figuring the fight out, but eventually opted to go back and grind some levels for Metis and refuse Aigis' team of personas, upon which these 2v2 fights felt much more beatable, but still not a total cakewalk due to the range of abilities these guys have, the lack of weaknesses, and the supposedly 20% high counter proc rate. I remember feeling pretty frustrated in the moment, but I think that was mostly because I was ready to be done with episode Aigis at that point, and stubbornly did not want to drop the difficulty, as I'd gone so far on Heartless difficulty already. Plus, in Reload, you can't return to Merciless or Heartless difficulty if you drop down, something I actually kind of like from a commitment standpoint. Despite that frustration in the moment, the more I actually reflect on how these fights are designed, the more I realize this is the higher difficulty people, including myself, have been wanting from these games. Now, maybe not in this exact form for various reasons people might have. After all, this was a drastic difficulty spike from what came before, and also led the final boss to feel trivial in comparison, but I think this is a step in the right direction in this regard. Now, with all of that said, Persona 3 Reload still remains my preferred version of Persona 3. However, episode Aigis in particular is something I think I'm content to leave behind following this initial playthrough. What started as an enjoyable excuse to revisit P3R without committing to a full replay eventually wore out its welcome, primarily due to the underwhelming narrative elements and lack in gameplay variety compared to the base game, among other things. Next up, in terms of Megami Tensei games to talk about, will be Raido Remastered, which I have been enjoying my time with quite a bit. Until then, though, I do want to thank my channel members and shout out Space Cowboy EXE at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.